In our last class, we talked about post-childhood stress disorder. And if you didn't get this out of that, I'm going to say it a different way. In fact, you'll discover as you listen to DVDs and video chats and so on, that there are a lot of concepts that I say in 100 different ways. Turns out there's a reason for that, since the entire world doesn't believe these principles and doesn't live by them. We really can't talk about them too much and can't talk about the basics too much. Many times I get emails from people who say, I didn't understand a principle, and they often say it in a way that makes me feel stupid, but I get over it fairly quickly. They say, well, if only you'd said it this way before. But it turns out that I'll say it 100 different ways, and there's one magical way that poof, somehow sneaks into the synapse in their head that is for that particular principle. So hence my repeating things often, but in different ways. Somebody once said, I read your book and I noticed that you say many things 3 or 4 times. You just sprinkle them throughout the book. Yeah, I know. They were telling me as though I didn't realize I was repeating myself, but I really do. And it's the way we learn. Repetition. We have, after all, had the wrong way repeated tens of thousands of times in our lives. So sometimes repeating something the right way more than once is a good thing. So if you didn't get out of last time what I'm going to say next, I'm going to say it more plainly. And that is that love is not just important in our lives. Love is air. We have to have it. Love is not the whipped cream on top of the cake. It's the cake, the main courses, and the table it sits on. It's everything. So if we don't have a sufficient supply of it, we get what we talked about last time. Not enough love leads to empty and afraid, and then we are in pain, which is, of course, just utterly intolerable. Now, somebody asked me to describe what I mean by emptiness. I got to admit, I've never been asked that question that I can recall. So, just briefly, emptiness. It's lack. It's absence of what we need. Everybody uses a different word for emptiness, so this is not a silly question. Hollowness. Some people describe it as a flatness in their lives. Many people just say, well, something's missing. Or I lack connection, or I lack a sense of fulfillment, or I lack a sense of purpose. All of those things describe emptiness. You don't have enough of what you need. And in that condition, when we're in pain, we can't just live with it. You can't just live with pain and smile and move on. We do these things that we talked about last time. And it's with these getting and protecting behaviors that we find the different forms of imitation love and an infinite variety of combinations of them, to which we become then absolutely addicted, and we become confused and believe that when we get enough imitation love, and here's the ultimate disaster in life, no kidding. Not getting loved is the first one, but it's that we confuse the temporary pleasure, the temporary lessening of pain that we get from imitation love, we confuse that with happiness. And all of this pain, all of this misery started very early in life. We know that embryos learn musical rhythms, embryos learn patterns, embryos learn feelings. So one of the features that characterizes the increased likelihood of PTSD is pre-existing stress. Well, in PCSD, post-childhood stress disorder, an unloving childhood is the stress that pre-exists everything else. In fact, most children are born in stress. Now, we all know, medically speaking, that children who are born of, say, a cocaine addicted mother or a tobacco addicted mother or alcohol addicted mother. These kids are born with physical stress from which sometimes they don't recover. What we don't identify is that many children are born with emotional stress already before they've taken their first breath, and then we wonder why they behave in a peculiar way. One day I turned on the shower, I tested the temperature of the shower with my hand, I jumped in the shower and immediately jumped right back out because it felt like I had been scalded. Only then, after I jumped back out of the shower, I know, forgive me for that mental image, but only when I jumped out of the shower did I remember that I had, in the hours prior to that moment, been working outside, and I had been burning piles of brush. I'm a bit of a pyromaniac, and so I love to get closer and closer to the fire, and I tend to haul huge logs and piles of brush very close. And that particular day, I'd gotten really close to the fire, enough that I had mild first-degree burns all over my body, on my face, neck, arms, chest, back. And because of those mild first-degree burns, which frankly I'd forgotten about, I was not in pain when I jumped into the shower. But with the addition of the slightly elevated temperature of the shower, now keep in mind our body temperature is, like 99 degrees. And most people shower at about 105, 106 degrees. So the shower was only a little bit hotter than my body temperature, and yet it felt like I was having molten lead poured over me. Well, maybe slight exaggeration, but it brought to my mind the fact that I had been previously burned, and that's why the shower, which normally at that temperature would not have bothered me, suddenly became a burning experience. What we don't understand, what we have never understood, most of us, and even if we do understand, we forget, is that we burn our children. There's an awful picture, but with every unkind word, tone, glance, facial expression, we burn our children. And then we keep burning them. So we burn them and then throw them in scalding water. And, if that weren't enough, then we throw them into the fire. And then they spend an entire lifetime feeling burned. And then overreacting, as I did, to any little thing that comes along that resembles a burn. In my case, a really fairly normal temperature shower. So it's incredibly ironic that we don't remember the traumas that have almost entirely shaped our lives. I mean, the irony of that is staggering. The things, the events that have shaped who we are, we don't remember. There's something wrong with this picture. So we have to get a better understanding of how we got where we are, or we can't really repair the damage. We also don't remember the good influences either. But just because we don't remember our early experiences doesn't mean that they're not all important. So I just got back from visiting two of my grandchildren. Turns out that we also visited our daughter and her husband, but we don't really care about them anymore now that they have children. And so they were ages 2 and 3. It's actually 3 and then almost 2 by like nothing. So 2 and 3. And we played in the hotel pool, and we pushed carts everywhere, and we ran, and well, they ran, and I tried to walk fast. We laughed, we threw them in the air, we shot off fireworks, we fell down and put Band-Aids on knees, we hugged, we carried them on shoulders, we fed them, we threw them up and down in the air and threw them on the couch and on pillows, and we did all kinds of just really cool things just all day long for several days. And I commented to my daughter that later in life, perhaps even in a month, these kids probably wouldn't remember a single one of these events, even though they were very cool and laughed and played and just looked like they were having the time of their lives. They won't remember them. But the events of that day did contribute to how they felt, and will contribute to how they will feel for the rest of their lives. They accumulate, just like trauma does. As a result of those happy days, and many like it before, and many days hopefully like it afterward, they will feel loved, accepted, encouraged, protected, cared for, safe. And these feelings will teach them what? If we are loved as children, we learn that the world is safe. We learn that it's nurturing. We learn that it's fun. We learn that the world itself is a happy place from all of these itty-bitty little teeny experiences that we've been having all of our lives. If we are loved as children, we learn that we are worthwhile, that we are loved, that we're incredibly powerful. I mean, my little 2-year-old grandson, he has a vocabulary of one sound. He goes, mm. And if he says, with a certain tone, everybody scurries to get him what he wants. And the game is to figure out what that particular means. If he says, that means no usually, but it depends on the tone. So here's this little, 1+ year-old kid who drives the world around him. He's incredibly powerful because people love him enough to interpret his amazingly limited little vocabulary. And yet someday he will learn to speak much more, but he's learned that he's powerful now, and he's going to keep that feeling. If we're loved, we learn that we are curious because we're not afraid. We learn that we're capable of enormous creativity. In short, we learn that we are bloody invincible. No kidding. I am not exaggerating. When we feel loved, we are that strong. I don't mean strong, powerful as in controlling other people. That powerful and strong as in we can choose to be happy no matter what the circumstances are around us. Now, what if I had been, during the visit with the grandkids, what if I had been impatient, irritated, curt, short, controlling with the kids? In a month, would that 2- and 3-year-old remember the specifics of anything I did? Very unlikely. Actually, no. But the damage would still be done. And it's done by parents everywhere. Let me give you a really specific example. So, for example, the 2-year-old, Bruce. Bruce eats everything from the middle. Now, you couldn't possibly know what I'm talking about. I mean like the dead middle. So if you give him a hug, he holds in both hands and he eats it from the middle, which of course leads to the 2 ends falling down. But he doesn't care about that. He eats the middle. You give him a pie, he eats it from the middle. It's really kind of fun to watch. We went out to a restaurant and his mother took a dinner roll and split it in half and gave him half of it that was all buttered. Well, so I want you to picture this. So we have the plane of the half roll, which is kind of like a plate, and he eats it from the middle. So he goes to take a bite out of the middle of this thing, and in one bite then, he has butter on his face from forehead to chin. Nobody ever stops him from eating in the middle. It's really about as messy a way as you could eat. It's not especially effective. It's not efficient, but he likes it. And so nobody stops him. There's no, you should this or you shouldn't that. And he looks happier when he's eating than if he were at Disney World. Because he feels what? Worthwhile, loved, powerful, curious, capable of creativity. Certainly, I never would have thought of, eating a dinner roll from the middle. I asked them if they've ever given him a donut. How does he eat the middle out of that? But apparently they had not done that. This sounds like a small thing, but we ruin these experiences for children. Every day we say, stop this, don't do that. We were at a restaurant and there was a mother next to us with a child, probably 3 years old, so about the age of the older of the two grandchildren. And the kid had a pizza and reached out with his hand to pick off a piece of pepperoni to eat that first. The mother says, no. You know better than that. That's not how we eat a piece of pizza. And I'm thinking, I didn't know that. I'm really grateful I came to the restaurant today to learn that we don't eat pizza like that. She was instructing him as to the correct way, and more importantly, that his way was wrong. She said, eat it like this. So as a result, the child ate the pizza with the same facial expression that he would have had on his face if he had known that he was marching to the gallows to be hanged. Really, he just looked absolutely miserable while he ate his food, while Bruce, who was only 5 feet away, was having the time of his life with butter smeared from forehead to chin and ear to ear. I had an experience recently with a girl, we'll call her Susie, whose mother was like that, like the mother who controlled the errant pizza eater. And she was constantly telling her daughter how to eat, how to dress, how to walk, how to do her hair. So the child learned to be obedient and cooperative and absolutely no trouble. And everywhere that the mother went, she talked about how proud she was of her daughter. And she did this, of course, when the daughter was there. So the daughter learned what the right way was to be, just like the mother did with the, pizza eater. And she described her daughter as being so good because she was always cooperative, always obedient, always did what she was told. She wasn't like those kids who caused their parents so much trouble, by having a mind of their own. And I hear these stories quite a bit. People come here who are miserable. Their marriages suck. Their lives suck. Their jobs are miserable. Their kids are miserable. And I ask them, so how was your childhood? It was great. My childhood was really great. I was obedient and my parents loved me, and I'm looking at them going, impossible. And sometimes they'll say, well, how do you know? Because I'm looking at you. I worry possibly more about the kids who are ultra obedient and cooperative than I do about the kids who are intermittently rebellious or just absolutely have to do it their way. These kids have no creativity. They are not individuals. They're just extensions of one or both parents. So this Susie followed behind her mother everywhere she went. She did everything her mother told her to do. And finally, she became depressed as a teenager. You can imagine she didn't move out of the house, when she graduated from high school. So at age 26, she was so depressed she couldn't function. No job, lived at home, tried to kill herself several times. But she managed to connect with a real love group and tried to get help from them. And the mother put a stop to that like bloody death. So the mother pulled the daughter back into her fold and corrected her. Days ago, this obedient, cooperative, good child was found dead in a ditch. She had finally succeeded in killing herself. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't take the pain of being a mannequin, a doll, really, for someone else's amusement and control and power. So even though on the outside, this little girl had starched dresses, perfectly combed hair, always clean, never walked around with butter from forehead to chin and ear to ear. Oh, no, no, no. Never ate, pepperoni off her pizza. I mean, that's worth at least 10 years in a penitentiary. So she did all the right things, and now she's dead. So the effect of not being loved, let me state it again. Without enough love, we're empty and afraid, and we are in pain. Without love, we're taught that the world is painful, frightening, not to be trusted. We talked about this in our last class. We are taught that we are worthless, that we are objects to be used. We're taught that we are helpless. This business of loving a child or an adult is literally life or death. Let me tell you about a man who is 50 years old, not loved, neglected. So he did everything that he could to win his family's approval. He existed only to gain the approval of his parents and siblings. That was his purpose in life. So how much creativity do you think he experienced? None. You don't have to be creative when all you do is do what everybody tells you to do. Not loved, neglected, winning approval, and then he married. Oh, what a disaster. His primary goal in life was to learn to win the approval of his parents. So where do you think his wife fit in that? Not really. So his nuclear family, the one into which he was born, was always first. The family business was always first. His family cheated him as an employee in the family business. And so now, as a result of trying to please them, he has no job. The business has folded. He was cheated by his family out of his share of the business. He has no partner because she couldn't stand to live with somebody who thought that she came number 58 in a list of priorities, has very few skills in life, so he can't get a job. He's never worked for himself. He is a slave to pain, period. And he does whatever it takes to stop the pain right now. And that's crippling. So he and his wife would make plans, and at the last second, if either of his parents said, well, we'd like you to stop by the house. In his defense, I believe him when he says, well, I forgot about the plans with my wife. Because he was taught to do whatever it took to minimize his pain in that millisecond. He felt absolutely worthless, as it says here on the PowerPoint. He felt like an object to be used. He felt utterly helpless to ever say to his parents, no. Well, understandably, his wife got tired of being placed last, and she left him. Tell you about another man. He was belittled and criticized as a child. So he became angry. The people around him were angry all the time. They didn't care about him. Nobody took care of his emotional needs, so he learned to take care of himself. He became selfish. If you're in pain, you are selfish. If I drive a truck and park it on your foot, you will become selfish, because the primary focus of your life in that moment is what? The truck on your foot. Pain. Pain is what makes us selfish, not that we're somehow inherently evil. So when I talk about selfishness, I don't use that term as we often heard it as children. Oh, you're just being so selfish. No, I'm just saying selfish is a natural result of pain. When we're in pain, we take care of ourselves. So this man learned to take care of himself to the point that he actually qualified as having a narcissistic personality disorder. Now, we all have characteristics of narcissism, just like if you go through all the personality disorders, we all demonstrate some of the characteristics on a given day. But it becomes a personality disorder when it interferes with your life consistently interferes with your relationships consistently, and you cannot stop the destructive behaviors. This man couldn't. So he had the patience of a 2-year-old, because he learned early on that if he didn't see to his needs, no one ever would. So do you see? He learned that he was worthless. He learned that he was an object to be used. He also learned that other people were objects to be used by him. And he learned that unless he helped himself, he was helpless. So he's gotten to the place in his life where if he knows there's a candy bar on the table in the kitchen of the neighbor's house, and he were sitting on a bulldozer, he would drive it through the house to get the candy bar. And emotionally speaking, that's what he does. He just drives right through whatever to get what he wants. The definition of right is what he wants, period. That's what we do when we're selfish. It's what we do when we're in pain. And if in driving through the house, he managed to, kill a few people, well, then, so sad, oops, sorry, but he would do it again. He'd do it again 5 minutes later. So no relationships, none. No friends, no family, no partner, no job, went to prison for crimes that were, of course, not his fault, then more prison for violating parole. Take a guess, that wasn't his fault either. When we're in pain, nothing is our fault. We exist only to eliminate our pain. So nothing was ever his fault. He's always just doing something to get what he wants. Again, all about the word that we've been talking about again and again as we've been talking about PCSD, which is that the central role is pain. Now we're going to illustrate just a little bit more how pervasive and sneaky PCSD is. One of the more common causes of PTSD is belonging to and being abused by a cult. Now, we think we know what a cult is. No, kind of. I mean, they wear strange clothes and they're isolated and they tend to be run by a ruler who's really kind of weird and owns everybody's property and tells everybody what to do. So we tend to be able to identify a cult when it's really obvious. They live up in the mountains of Montana and everybody, including the 4-year-olds, carries, an automatic weapon. But let's talk about the characteristics of cults as described by experts in this subject, along with how these characteristics correspond to the function of most families and are therefore the cause of post-childhood stress disorder or PCSD. So some of the characteristics of a cult. A cult is controlled by a leader who is regarded as the supreme authority. Well, you don't get a more supreme authority than mom or dad. And how often is that power abused? How often are we acting in our child's interest when we tell them how to dress? When we tell them that that's not the right way to eat pizza? When we tell them that it's wrong, and we do this all the time, to wear shoes that don't match or socks that don't match? Or who are we thinking of? Ourselves. And who's the supreme authority? Me. Because I'm the dad. See? I mean, I was taught that as a kid, and I'm embarrassed to say I adopted that attitude at least 2 times as a parent. The cult leader tends to be domineering. Although we don't like to admit it, as parents, we very often dominate our children. Now, we do it with the excuse of, well, I'm just teaching them the right way to do things. Don't pick pepperoni off the pizza. No, that's not the right way. That's just domineering. You can't wear shoes that don't match. No, that's domineering. It's not helping your child in any conceivable way. I mean, if your child is going to be accepting an award at the Academy Awards, you might say something about matching shoes. Maybe. The odds that your 4-year-old will be doing that are fairly slim. And we justify the things that we tell our children by this famous saying that our children have come to just absolutely hate, because I said so. That's the definition of domineering, is it not? In a cult, there is no appeal outside the cult leader to higher systems of justice. How does a child appeal to an authority higher than his or her parents? Absolutely impossible. Allegiance to the cult takes priority over all other loyalties. What happens when a child begins to express a preference for or a greater allegiance to their friends, for example, which eventually happens with almost all children, or a school event, or preference for a kind of music, rather than being primarily loyal to their parents? Well, there's hell to pay. The child is punished, the child is corrected, the child is made to feel small or disloyal. We run our families like cults. We don't mean to do it, but that excuse of "I didn't mean to" just doesn't hold water. We don't mean not to either. Now, in our defense, we also don't realize we're doing it. Hardly ever, which is why we're here in this class learning that we do that as parents. A cult controls the possessions, the money, and the lives of its followers. Now, this describes the family to a T, or in this particular case, to a C. How often do parents say, "You will do what I say," as I said before, because I am the parent? The child, for example, a child owns an object, a toy. But if a younger sibling cries because the younger sibling wants it, well, what does the parent say? Because the parent acts in his or her own interest. They don't want to hear the crying. They don't want to have to teach the child. They don't want to have to deal with the conflict. They don't want to have to, well, frankly, be a parent. And so the parent says, grabs the toy, or orders the child who owns the toy, "Let your brother play with it." Well, if the government did that, it would be called illegal seizure. Or if you did it, it would be called illegal seizure. And a form of control that children just cannot make sense of. It just makes them, again, feel like objects and like they're helpless. We tell them how they can spend money that is theirs. Do it all the time. They get an allowance, they earn some money, they go and they decide that they're going to blow it all on whatever. Well, it's their money, baby. And if you gave them the money and told them it was theirs, then you don't get to tell them what to spend it on. Well, maybe short of, say, cocaine. But, not very many 6-year-olds have a cocaine dealer. I can still remember, I remember almost nothing about being age 8. And yet I remember saving my little pennies and nickels and dimes. And if I was really having a rich day, I'd get a quarter. And I saved them in a little green purse, plastic, with a transparent side so that you could see the money that was inside of it. I mean, talk about a vivid memory. I don't remember anything that I owned when I was 8 years old, but I remember that purse. Every day I would count the money that I had. My guess would be because it gave me a sense of control. So one day I come home and I go to find and I was saving it so that eventually I could afford to buy a bicycle, which I thought would be, well, at age 8, pretty much the key to happiness in the world. I get home and there's no money in my purse. I was devastated. I thought, somebody had broken in the middle of the night and stolen my purse, which, and it was a purse. I wasn't aware of that as a boy, or it would have probably bothered me, but that somebody had come in and stolen my, who knows, $15 probably. Children don't think clearly. And so I said to my parents that my money had been stolen. And it turns out that they had gone to the store with my money and they had bought a bicycle for me that I did not choose. I was not happy. So I'd been saving all this time to own a bike. Well, here was a bike. So you'd think that I'd be thrilled. No, not thrilled, because my ability to choose had been taken from me. Now, do I resent this experience now? No. In fact, until I was, thinking about this particular class, I hadn't thought about that experience in 20 years. But I use it to demonstrate that children absolutely hate being controlled, even if what you're giving them is for their best good, even if what you're giving them might be something they would want. They like to choose. And in a cult, like a family, they don't get to. The cult leaders are self-appointed, and they cannot be removed. That's the definition of parents. Two people marry or cohabit, and then they choose to bring into the cult these little followers who have absolutely no idea what they're in for. There might be, who knows, maybe the initial screaming when a child is born is that initial realization, holy crap, I had no idea. Children have no idea what they're in for. They're brought into a situation that they don't get to control. And they become, at a very early age, effectively enslaved. They don't like it. Cult leaders focus the love, devotion, and allegiance of the followers on themselves. How often do parents demand the love, respect, and loyalty of their children? Just like cult leaders, they say things like, you can't talk to me that way. You will give me the respect I deserve. I brought you into the world, I can take you out. Even innocent little things like, give mommy a kiss. Now, there's probably almost nobody watching who hasn't said those words. Well, if you're a guy, you probably haven't said mommy, but give mommy or daddy a kiss. Now, that doesn't sound like a bad thing. Almost uniformly, yeah, it is. Because what are we doing as cult leaders? Focusing the love, devotion, and allegiance of our little followers, the children, on us. If you have any doubt of that, watch the face of the parent. Of course, you'd have to look in the mirror, I suppose, if it's you. But watch the face of a parent if a kid says no. Or if the kid says no, watch the face of the kid. They obviously feel controlled. And getting these things, love, devotion, and allegiance, is the single greatest reason for parents to have children in the first place, which is an admission that almost all parents deny. But I've done a great deal of counseling with very young, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old girls who are single and are about to have a child. We have had them in our home during their time of pregnancy when it wasn't safe for them to go through that period with their own families who would have been abusive, emotionally at the very least. And I have heard them say over and over again, it's almost a mantra. So, are you going to keep the baby? Now, I'm not suggesting that abortion is the other alternative. What I mean is, are you going to keep the baby, or are you going to give the baby up for adoption? Because it's been fairly well proven, like beyond any shadow of doubt, that 13-year-old single girls are not great mothers. Of course, many 30-year-old married women are not great mothers either, or 30-year-old married men, great fathers, but it's way worse when the parent is really young. And so I sometimes have asked them, the answer is, I'm having this baby so I'll have someone to love me. The kid is doomed. Because then the kid is born, and the cult leader, the parent, discovers that this little kid doesn't have love, devotion, and allegiance to focus on the leader. In fact, the kid is one great big need machine. Gimme, 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 and gimme right now. And if you don't give them right now, they scream and cry and they poop their pants and they want to be fed. And then we wonder why they find little babies in dumpsters. And that's why. because the cult leader discovered that kids got no love, devotion, and allegiance to focus on anybody. Cults often dictate in great detail what members wear, eat, when and where they work, sleep, bathe, as well as what they believe, think, and say. This sound familiar? Either in the family where you're a parent, or does it sound familiar to when you were a child? What parents have not dictated all these behaviors to their children? I know of virtually none. Sure, they try to have good motives, but it often doesn't work out that way, and it certainly does not feel loving to the child. I have one granddaughter who's a good deal older. They keep changing their ages. It makes me crazy. 10. She's 10. And she has a very interesting taste in clothing. 99 out of 100 mothers would stop her on the way out the door because what she wears is very original. We know because we get pictures in emails. But it turns out, wow, has that nurtured her creativity? And so, while other 10-year-olds are playing video games, this kid is designing clothing. It's her goal, at least at this point, who knows what she's going to do, to become a clothing designer, because she's been allowed to exercise her creativity. Who cares what she wears? The school would frown if she showed up at school naked, but she wouldn't do that. She just shows up in really kind of unusual apparel. One grandchild took to sleeping in the closet for a while. Well, gosh, no parent would allow that. You can't sleep in the closet. Closets are not for sleeping. The kid just wanted to experiment with what it's like to sleep in a closet. What's the harm? I've often considered requiring my children to sleep in a closet, locked. We tell them what to do about things that just frankly don't matter. We overbathe little children. There are mothers and fathers who require their little teeny kids to bathe every day. And it's been pretty much demonstrated by the American Academy of Pediatrics that until a kid gets to the place where they stink, 8 to 10, depends on the age of the kid, they're really not all that dirty. If you have a doubt, smell them. In fact, you overbathe them, it dries out their skin, and they can get some pretty significant skin disorders. We correct what they think and say. We correct them all the time. They make a drawing, and they put a body part in the wrong place, and we tell them that it should be someplace else. Well, where do you think science fiction illustrators came from? Putting body parts in the wrong place, or drawing them not to scale, or whatever. In fact, isn't that where all creativity comes from, is breaking the mold? And yet we're constantly telling our children, no, not like that. No, don't do it like that. We're driving along the road, and Sylvie, who's 3, another granddaughter, says, oh, look, there's a turtle in the road. So I stopped to look at the turtle. No, turns out it's part of a coconut husk. But we let her figure that out instead of telling her, oh no, you're wrong. There are very few occasions where we really have to tell our children that they're wrong. Dad, I'm going to set fire to the house. Okay, all right, that would be wrong. The cult tends to have a double set of ethics. Members are urged to be open and honest within the group and to confess everything to the leaders. Does this sound familiar? Children to parents? But the leaders have a different set of standards, and they are not open and honest about their own mistakes. I don't know many parents who don't have a double standard with their children, and the children know it, which is why they often complain that things are not fair, and the kids are right. Children are encouraged to tell the truth. Always tell daddy the truth, say the parents. But how often do the parents tell the truth? How often have you heard a parent say, how often have you as a parent said, I was wrong? Pretty rare. And yet we encourage our children to say that. So we set a pretty crummy example. I had a woman say to me recently, my father is the most brilliant man to ever live. He's almost 90 years old, and in 90 years he's never been wrong. Well, what a terrible example of learning to a child. So the man's just always right. He doesn't make mistakes, which are necessary in the process of learning. How can we expect them to learn without admitting mistakes? And we're the ones who set examples for them to do that. But most parents don't do that. As cult leaders, we don't. Members of the cult derive a great part of their identity from simply being members of that cult. For how many children is their primary identity derived from family membership? Now, that can be a good thing because it gives them a sense of connection to the family. But if that's not accompanied by love, the effects are awful. So I watched an 8-year-old kid at a baseball game, and I heard the father loudly remind him, and I'm changing the last name because I can't remember the kid's last name, but the father loudly reminded this 8-year-old child, now remember, you are a Smith. And if you fail to get a hit, you will have embarrassed the entire family. And shame, he didn't go on, but you could just hear from the tone of voice. You would shame me and your mother and your siblings and your grandfather and great-grandfather and back for at least 12 generations, and the curse of the family will come down on your head. My goodness. That's way too much pressure to put on a kid. If a member leaves a cult, they are shunned, shamed, and punished. It's not an uncommon threat for parents to say to a child who is running away or who is even just walking out the door being rebellious, you walk out that door, you don't come back. And if the threat isn't spoken, the children still understand that leaving their family would not be well received. So they're shunned, shamed, and punished. And there are some cultures in which that is done really very formally. They are formally shunned for doing anything that would bring shame on their family, especially from leaving it. If a member disobeys a cult leader, it is equated with disobeying God. Parents have an influence that is ultimate. They define the world for a child. They're not godlike, they are God. So it's unavoidable that parents are the primary means by which children gain an acquaintance with God. So it's only natural that they would link disobedience to one with disobedience to the other. And the cult leader, the parent, has taught them that they will be cursed, shunned, punished, and in every way disparaged if they disobey the parent. Every person that I know of who has a negative opinion of God, spirituality, religion, pick a thing, had a negative relationship with the parent who becomes a representative of God. Members are often forced in a cult to keep rules that are unimportant or make no sense. What child hasn't complained about this kind of injustice? That they can't wear their hair the way they want to, they can't keep their room the way they want to, they can't wear the clothing, they hear don't eat the pepperoni, whatever. And see, these kids are not stupid. This little 3-year-old that I watched as his mother said, you can't eat the pepperoni first. You could see the look on the child's face like, are you crazy? And yet the child has no choice. He can't fight his mother, who outweighs him, 10 to 1. He doesn't stand a chance. If a member is less than completely obedient, they are banned from the cult. And in many families, you are thrown out, banned, disowned if you get, say, pregnant, join the wrong church, if you embarrass the family enough. The bottom line is, after all this talk about cults, is that in a cult, you are used, not loved. And in most families, we are used, not loved. Used for affection, used for power, used for whatever. And the effect we've already described, and we'll probably describe it more than once. That children are smart enough to know that they're smart enough to feel that they're not being sufficiently loved. They become empty and afraid, and the result is pain. And it's awful. And in that pain, we are taught that the world is painful, frightening, and not to be trusted, and that we are worthless. that we're objects to be used, and we are helpless. Children who have not been unconditionally loved uniformly have poor, what the world calls self-esteem. Now, I say that because I really hate the term self-esteem, because it's really not self-esteem. Self-esteem implies that it's, an esteem that we chose. We didn't choose it. We didn't develop it. It's actually the esteem that others gave us, and we had little to no choice about believing it. So rather than self-esteem, it's really kind of an other esteem. What we are taught in childhood tends to be permanent. And we are taught culturally, we're taught politically, we're taught socially. Culturally, for example, if you are taught in your culture that certain people are inferior, then they are. I had a good friend who was raised in South Carolina, which is the state where there was the greatest percentage in the entire South of slavery. And he was taught that blacks were really not quite human beings. I was in the room when one day he said, he was probably 55, roughly, at the time. He said, I'm beginning to consider that black parents actually love their children like white parents love their children. Now, that may sound laughably bigoted and ignorant to you, but because he had been taught that blacks were inferior and not really quite human beings from the time he was a little kid, he believed it completely. If a little black child is taught by white people that he's inferior, he'll believe it. More commonly, little black children are taught that they're inferior by their black parents. So what we're taught culturally at a sufficiently young age, so for example, white people aren't allowed to use the N-word with black people, and yet black people use it with each other all the time. And listen to the way it's used. Listen to the tone of voice. It is not used in a positive way, as in, you are such a sweet flower in my life. Different tone of voice. I have a friend who is of Indian descent, Indian as in from the country India. He was raised in England, where the term Paki is a derogatory term, very much like the N-word. And it's used to describe both those people who are of Indian descent and Pakistani descent. So apparently whoever came up with the term wasn't really culturally very smart either. And when he was a child, because he was taught by his parents and by others that being a Paki was a bad thing, he, being technically a Paki because he's from Indian descent, he would call other kids of Indian descent Paki on the school ground. So, what an absurdity. It made him feel less inferior to call other people a term that would actually be applied to himself. We are politically educated at a very young age. It was established for years and years that however your parents vote, that's how you'll vote. Then the 60s came along. And then kids voted, they learned to vote exactly the opposite of how their parents voted, not realizing that by doing so, they were still controlled by their parents' vote. What we're taught early on tends to stick with us forever. What we're taught is socially correct. We tend to believe all of our lives from a very early age. So, like I said, I was just recently with two of the younger grandkids, and the almost 2-year-old, when we go to a restaurant, he makes use of every square inch of the restaurant. He gets down and he just wanders around, and he just runs off. He doesn't look back to see where his parents are. He doesn't give a hoot. He just wanders all through the restaurant, and he'll just stop by people's, tables and, pick food off their plates, which would, of course, be absolutely horrifying to most mothers. Now, we kind of take turns. Usually his dad, or if I'm there, I do it just because, it's time for dad to get a break. We just kind of follow at a distance where he doesn't even notice that we exist. And if he's bothering somebody, we watch their faces, then we might step in and pick him up and move him to the next table. But unless the reaction is overtly negative, we just leave him alone. And as a result, he's absolutely unafraid. You take some kids and put them in a strange social environment and they're paralyzed. This kid just sort of wanders everywhere and makes friends of whoever, and some people don't like that, but frankly, he doesn't care, and at that age, why should he? Whereas most kids here, don't do that, stop that, we don't do that, that's not right, it's impolite to intrude upon others. And if that's how you're raised, then you would tend to become fearful of people. You would tend to find it harder to make friends, harder to form partnerships with other people. So why is it important to understand all this, what we're taught in childhood? Because with kids, we're trying to control the outward signs of the problem, and we're not describing the problem. So, for example, the shooting in Connecticut, and everybody just went crazy. We need to control guns. Yeah, because, 1 million people in Rwanda weren't hacked to death with, machetes. We focus on what is more, we talked about this before, what is more proximal, what is closer, what is more obvious. And we miss the root cause. So recently there was an abduction of a 16-year-old girl who was, taken to the woods, and oh my goodness, we focus on lack of parental control and sex deviance, and nobody talks about the fact that this might have something to do with how she was raised. And I don't know how she was raised, so I'm not making an accusation about that. But the kid who shot all the kids up in Connecticut had a demonstrably not normal childhood. I watched a program just 2 hours ago about a man who was eventually convicted, sent to prison for being a hitman for the mafia. And we go, oh, what a terrible thing. And I could only watch part of the little documentary because they wanted to sensationalize, what he'd done. The important part was when he described his childhood, and his father would just come into the room, wake him up out of a sound sleep, and just administer random beatings from time to time, just because, he was in a bad mood, drunk or not. His mother would whip him and beat him. He was raised absolutely without love in his life. So now, imagine if somebody is raised without love in their lives, what attachment would they have to human beings as a whole? Because after all, our parents represent mankind. They're not just our parents, they're the world. Well, he wouldn't have any attachment. Then as he got older, he was picked on and he was beaten by, the school kids. Again, no attachment to human beings. So one day he went up there and he grabbed a rod out of the closet, the clothes closet, and took it down and just, beat the living daylights out of the kids who'd been picking on him. And from then on, if anybody caused him any pain at all, he would severely punish them. And then eventually he killed a guy and another guy. And then he connected with some people from the mob, and they said, well, you've got a useful skill. And he ended up killing, they figured, probably 200 people. And he was asked how he felt about that. He said, I don't feel one way or the other. And why would he? If he hadn't been treated kindly, if he hadn't developed a loving connection toward human beings, what would it mean to him to kill a human being? No more than to kill, say, a roach. We are missing the point. So I'm pretty bad at following the news, I got to admit, but I've been seeing a lot lately about how the United States is contemplating going to war, if I understand it right, going over to Syria, and because Syria was violent to their people. Now, in somebody's mind, this actually makes sense. But because the Syrian government was violent, we're going to teach them by being violent to them. So we're going to fight violence with violence, and then hopefully somebody out of that's going to learn peace. I don't know how we figured this, but because I guess several hundred people were killed with sarin gas, which I'm not saying is a good thing to do. And yet we ignore the millions and millions of children who are emotionally crippled and even destroyed, like this girl who died in a ditch alone. We don't do anything about that. There are no newspaper articles about that. You don't see on the front page headline of the New York Times, insufficient real love in world, major problem. No. Instead, we talk about sarin gas and abductions and rapes, and we're really kind of just emotional voyeurs. We love the vicarious victimhood of getting involved in drama instead of solving the root problems. The root problems, solving those would, of course, require that we actually pay attention to our own behavior, learn something, and change our behavior. And gosh, we wouldn't want that. That's not nearly as cool as, watching depictions of violence and crime and fires and all that kind of thing. The problem, as we are not focusing on what matters, is that the Titanic is sinking. And instead of paying attention to that, to the hole in the side of the ship, we're disconnecting the alarm system that is screaming, abandon ship, abandon ship. We're trying to get rid of the noise. We're always paying attention to the klaxon, the sound of the horn, versus the hole. So what's the hole? The hole is the root wound that we virtually all experience from the time that we were little kids. It's the I don't love you message. It's the I don't love you message that is destroying the world. Do you think that if children had been unconditionally loved from the time they were born, do you think they would be administering sarin gas to their neighbors? Not a chance. You think they'd be abducting 16-year-old girls and taking them out into the woods? No. You think there's any guy who has been unconditionally loved from birth who has sexually assaulted a woman? No. There hasn't been. But we focus on the crime because that's, way more interesting, lots more salacious, certainly much more newsworthy, and we're not paying attention to what we can do about it. I hear from people every single day who describe some horrible crime that's been committed in their lives. And I always listen for a while because people need to be listened to long enough so that so that they feel like you understand. But eventually it's, so what are we going to do? And what we're missing is that from early childhood, every sigh, every frown, every harsh tone, every criticism communicates, I don't love you. People swear to me that they were loved. Pretty much, 80% of the people that I talk to who are having miserable lives, miserable jobs, miserable marriages, and so on, they say, well, but I was loved. That's like somebody coming in from outside. They're soaked from head to toe and say, it's not raining. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure this out. And we hear this message all day, every day. But because it's all we've ever heard, it's all we've ever known, because it's the water in which we swim, because it's the polluted air that we breathe, we don't know any difference. And for children, there's only one reason that they are not loved. Life ain't complicated for a kid. Children don't sit around and go, right now I'm feeling loved at a 3.6. No, 7, 3.7 out of 10. No, No, children either feel loved or they don't. I got to watch that with my grandchildren. Now, sometimes they misinterpret things, that are done, like as in, you have to get down from your high chair now and go to bed. And, sometimes they interpret that as everybody hates me. But for children, life is very simple. They're happy or they're not. They feel loved or they don't. And if they don't feel loved, there's only really one conclusion that they can come to. They're not loved because they're not worth loving. They're worthless. And why? Well, because the people whose responsibility it is to love them are God. Children are valued as worthless by the people they trust most, by their parents, by their teachers, by their friends. And they can only accept their valuation by these trusted people. There is not a 3-year-old on earth who, when his father is yelling at him and criticizing him and telling him not to pick the pepperoni off the pizza, there's not a 3-year-old on earth who's going to look up at his dad and go, so Dad, is this really about me, or is this about you? Is this about you not feeling loved, or you having a need to control me? Nah. They take it personally. And this wound, feeling worthless, affects every perspective the child has, usually for a lifetime, because what we learn earliest is what we learn best. It's what we learn deepest. I had a woman who was telling me the history of being sexually abused by one man after another. Her brother, his friends, her grandfather, neighbors, babysitters, just went on and on. She was raped repeatedly as a child while her parents were in the next room. I asked her a question that she said she had never been asked before, because when somebody describes a trauma like this, we uniformly sympathize with them. We cry with them and say, gee, that's really terrible, which is really not what they need. They need greater understanding. They need genuine love, not just, which is different from sympathy. So I said, so why didn't you call out? Or why didn't you tell your parents that these things were happening? And she said, she said it so beautifully. One sentence. She said, because they wouldn't have believed me. And I said, and why wouldn't they? She couldn't answer that question, so I answered it for her. Because you felt like you were worthless. She said, oh my gosh, that's absolutely why. Do you know how many women I've talked to who were sexually abused when they were kids, and when they finally did tell, in most cases, their mothers didn't believe them because it would have been caused too much uproar in the family to bring that up. Their mothers simply didn't want to confront their fathers, as in the mother's father, or their own husbands. So they just chose not to believe their child, which tells the child what? Everybody else matters except me, and my opinion is worthless. This woman, of course, was raped in college, while there were people in the next room who could easily have stopped the trauma. And I said, why didn't you scream for help? She said, I was ashamed. Now, she'd been in therapy all of her life. She'd been treated for PTSD all of her life. Nothing had made any difference because they weren't paying attention to the fact that the problem was her sense of worth, not what was done to her. Most of us are fatally confused between who we are and what was done to us. Most of us have been so enmeshed in and mired in what was done to us, we don't even know who we are. We've been reacting to our pain all of our lives, so we've become just one great big pain reacting machine. We just reflexively react to pain. We don't know how to make proactive, conscious choices at all. We're always responding to what has been done to us, or is being done to us, or both. So I taught this to the sexually abused woman who had been abused a lot of times, and in fact went around identifying herself as a survivor of sexual abuse. That was her identity. She would say, "Hello, my name is Susie, I'm a survivor of sexual abuse," as though that were her last name. So I loved her. We talked about the conscious choices, semi-conscious choices that she had made since being abused, like using her abuse as a victim so that people would pay attention to her, like being selfish, like manipulating people for her sympathy, and so on. And as a result of being loved for who she really is, she is now happy in a long-term relationship. Life can be unbelievably confusing. We are the objects of so many bizarre, protective, hurtful behaviors from other people, and we ourselves demonstrate bizarre, defensive, hurtful behaviors to other people. And why do we do this? Back to the same answer we've been talking about today and in our last class. Pain, but we miss the cause. We think the cause of our pain is what is happening right now, an easy source of misunderstanding, or that others are treating us badly because of what we're doing right now. When we're in pain, we are fatally distracted by what I call the proximal event. Probably comes from years of medical training. Proximal meaning closer. The closest thing happening, ignoring the lifelong and true underlying cause of our pain. And what's the real cause of our pain? No surprise. Worthless. We cannot live with that feeling. We can't live with that pain. So we manipulate, we lie, we attack, we do all the stuff that we do so that we can feel less helpless. Let me illustrate with a story of a couple. So Mark, we'll call him. Sometimes I can't remember later whether I actually changed the name or not. So Mark never met his original father. He was raised by a stepfather who was abusive to him and to his mother. His mother and his stepfather divorced when he was 13. And I emphasize for the 1,000th time that divorce is not what hurts children. What hurts children is the lack of love that led to the divorce and hurts the child, both. So he married, having been raised in absolutely loveless homes. And after 10 years and one child, he was divorced, went into alcohol rehab. He married again. He was divorced after 2 years. He's getting faster now, went into drug rehab. He married after 1 year and more rehab, divorced again, and his anger was just increasing. So he meets and marries Cindy. And Cindy's father was alternately absent or abusive. Her mother was completely emotionally absent. Her father died homeless and an alcoholic. So how emotionally skilled do you think her father was? She was married 3 times, married at 20. Her husband cheated on her. Her stepfather committed suicide. Her mother cleaned her stepfather's brains off the wall. What a miserable pair of human beings. He learned to cope by withdrawing from everything. He just ran from pain constantly. He would drink, he would use drugs, he would withdraw from conversations. She reacted to life by being a controller. So I started with her and just loved her. Really simply. Would have her describe her behaviors and just simply loved her and said, "Honey, until you stop controlling, you'll stay miserable till you're dead. Astonishingly, she simply quit. He refused, however, to feel, in many cases, once a controller stops, then the runner can feel the love of the person who used to be a controller. In his case, the wounds were too deep. He arrived at the intervention stoned on drugs and stayed stoned the entire way. They went back home. He became more and more abusive. At one point, picked her up and threw her into a doorway, and of course said that he had just been trying to get by her and bumped her, and eventually ended up in jail. So she learned what it meant to be unconditionally loved and to stop her controlling and to be happy and to leave this horrifyingly abusive relationship. He did not. But it's still a huge win because she has the kids. She's going to raise them in a much more loving environment. Not everybody gets real love. Some people are too wounded, or we don't know why. Sometimes it's not the extent of the wounds. But the real problem was that these two were screwed from the beginning. Neither of them had ever felt unconditionally loved, so there wasn't a chance in hell that these two were going to create an unconditionally loving marriage, a marriage that would be happy. No way. So what is the solution? Pretty simple. We talked about this in the last class. We remember what's true. Somebody, whether it's my daddy, my mommy, and I don't mean necessarily biological parents, which is actually unusual, but somebody that we look to as a parent figure, somebody in a real love group, a wise man, a wise woman, a friend, somebody loves me. The instant that we can remember that, we can't feel worthless anymore. God loves me, so I'm never alone. I have everything I need and nothing to fear, and I am so grateful. When people remember that, it works. No kidding. 35-year-old man called me who had been completely uninvolved as a father and husband, didn't interact with his kids, didn't interact with his wife, nothing, except for conflict. And when he did fight with his kids, his wife would call me and say that he was in there having a fist fight like with a peer, with his 8-year-old. So emotionally speaking, he may not have even been 8. So I spoke to him on the phone and I said, for 24 hours, you just walk around the house going, my daddy loves me. In this case, me, because I had spent enough time with him that I was the only source of unconditional love he'd known, a father. Just a few days later, he wrote, he said, I've been keeping up with the reminders to myself daily. In fact, he set a timer on his smartphone so that it went off every 15 minutes. And he would go through the 5 truths. But he always started off with, my daddy loves me. And he said, it has changed everything. And he wasn't just making it up because his wife confirmed that. These truths are huge. When we remember them, it's just almost impossible to be unhappy, no matter what's happening around us. We forget what is true, like the 5 truths, because of an onslaught of how people behave while they're enacting the lies they believe. We believe that we're worthless because of the way people treated us when we were children and because of the way they often are still treating us. So then we fight and defend what we see as attacks, and they often are, and confirmations of our worthlessness everywhere. This 35-year-old man continues. He says, of course, I don't always remember. It does seem to be becoming more of a habit, though. Yesterday morning started a little rough with me bullying the kids and definitely heading down the wrong track. I picked up on the fact that my wife's attitude toward me had changed to hostile, and instead of getting caught up in it, the bullying and his wife's hostile attitude, he said, the alarm went off on my smartphone, and as soon as I said, my daddy loves me, it turned around. That's pretty remarkable faith, pretty remarkable trusting on his part. He said, I ended up having a great day with the kids and was able to be there and was able to be loving for my child when he had a tough moment. How do we get this kind of healing? Back to the 5 truths, but also as a result of telling the truth about ourselves to somebody who is wise enough and loving enough to care about us. Now, how often do I have to do this? I don't have to tell the truth about my past and about how I was sexually abused as a child a million times. You don't need to go over that and over and over and over that. It's often very helpful for one person to know all the truth about you so that you feel like you've completely disclosed, but you don't have to tell all the details to every person you meet. In fact, you can kind of take it as a guideline that it's helpful to talk about our pain only until we feel like people understand us. And then we can move on to healing, not more storytelling. Many people in real love groups, it might be the most common failing in real love groups and in conference calls, is that people describe the same pain over and over and over and over. A lady called me who's new to real love, in fact, just earlier today, and she said, on some of the conference calls, the same person goes from call to call to call and tells the same story, and nobody ever stops them. And I said, how do you know it's the right thing to stop them? She says, because you stopped me. I thought that was pretty insightful. And I don't mean stop somebody when they're describing their pain the first time, but telling the same pain over and over again, it just doesn't help. If I wake up in the morning and go, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, how many times would I have to say that before I would feel afraid and would feel in pain? Not many. I got a call hours ago from a woman who had just learned that she has invasive breast cancer. Well, I didn't go, well, we're not going to talk about pain and fear. No, we do need to talk about our pain, but only until we feel like people understand us. So she talked about her pain. She talked about her fear of dying. She talked about her fear of being disabled, her fear, in this particular case of invasive breast cancer, of being disfigured. But then after she knew I understood her, then we moved on to healing and focusing on there's only one moment you really have control of, and that's this one. So I told her, honey, I get it all. I get it that you might be disfigured, you might become sick, you might end up in terminal pain and die. I got it. And the only moment we have right now that we know about is this one. And in this moment, you're not alone. In this moment, you're being loved. And if we focus on fear in this moment, you won't have that. And so you'll have fear, 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 fear. Then you'll get to your pain and your operation. And if you die, all you'll have had from this moment until you're dead is fear and pain. Is that really how you want to live the last whatever of your life? None of us knows how long we're going to live. I might live 30 more years. I might live 30 more seconds. I had a good friend in medical school, and he tended to live life from moment to moment. He was a happy man. And what they call a berry aneurysm, an aneurysm in the, won't mean anything, probably the circle of Willis in the brain. It burst, poof, he was walking, he fell over, and he was dead. Just like that, poof. And that can happen to any of us. So why spend any of the precious few moments we have focusing on our pain, focusing on our fear, even though we might be in pain, even though there are things that pretty much everybody would be afraid of. We don't have to choose to be afraid. Because if I remember that there's somebody who loves me and God loves me and I'm not alone and I have nothing to fear, well then, poof, my pain goes away. It really does work like that. But we really are surrounded by influences that do not teach this. And so we've been wounded so many times. We've had no respite, no rest from our pain, from being told that we're worthless. And then we respond badly. Our pain from feeling worthless makes us quite insane. In fact, the short version of this is pain is insane, or pain causes insane. When we're in pain, we don't think clearly, we don't see clearly, we don't feel clearly, we do everything badly. One woman wrote me hours ago and said, I have a difficult decision to make and I'm so afraid of making a mistake. And I said, as long as you're afraid of making a mistake, you won't be able to make a good decision. For some people here, some people get to a place of fear and craziness where they can't even hear the course correction. And so she just kept repeating her fear. And so she ended up not making a decision. And so because she had waited past a certain deadline, other people took the decisions out of her hands, and she's not going to like what they've done. No blaming her. She was raised in an insane environment, but she was in enough pain that she became crazy enough that she could not make a sane decision. We don't have to keep talking about the pain and the insanity. We can just heal. What's that look like? Well, I'm just going to show you 3 pictures. This first one is a picture of the 10-year-old fashion designer I was telling you about, Megan, and her incomparably beautiful grandmother, Donna, and it's a card that the fashion designer created herself. You can see her creativity right there on the card. And it says, the best grandma ever. Why? Because grandma sends her the most money for Christmas, because grandma has given her a scholarship for the rest of her life for her education. No, because she feels loved by her grandmother. And look at the expression on that kid's face. Priceless. By the way, I never get pictures that, best grandpa. I used to be her favorite, years ago. And then she discovered she was a girl, and then I just died. So we went to visit him one day, and I said hello, and she walked right past me and gave her grandmother a hug. And I said, what about me? And she said, you'll be all right. That's feeling confident about who you are. She wrote a poem to her grandmother. She said, you've got tons of work and jobs, but you still got time to love me gobs. I am in Georgia, Rome, the place I call my home. Now, she doesn't live in Rome, and her parents love her, and she knows that. She's just expressing that in a beautiful way, that home is where you feel loved. And that's how loved children express themselves. One last little illustration from a child. She said, she writes these little poems, by the way. She said, the title of the poem is I Love You. From your head to your toes, from your kindness to your clothes, I will still love you. From your smile to your cherry coke, from your laugh to your floors that are oak, I will always love you. There's just no more powerful force on earth for healing and for good than love. And that's why we're here together in this class, to learn more about love, to learn what it's like, to learn its qualities, to learn to feel it, and the ultimate, to learn to share it with others. I've enjoyed loving you and wish you well in the coming week as you practice loving others. Good to spend the class time with you. See you shortly.